Hello, everybody. I'm Mark Schneider, and I want to welcome you to today's episode 173 of Say What, where we talk about the threats to our children in the public school system, including how, despite the presumption of church and state, religion continues to underlie much of what is taught in the nation's classrooms. No, I'm not talking about Judeo-Christian beliefs, what used to inform educational institutions, but something else altogether, something that predates Western culture, but which is making a dramatic, if not frightening, comeback. For anybody wanting to know what this religion looks like, consider the opening ceremonies of the recent Paris Olympics. As celebrated there, and now increasingly in our nation's schools, the religion I'm referring to is paganism, or perhaps more accurately, neo-paganism. Here to discuss this trend is my guest today, John Daniel Davidson. Mr. Davidson is a senior editor at the Federalist, where he covers politics, immigration, culture, and religion. John has appeared on an assortment of national TV broadcasts. In addition, his writing has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Claremont Review of Books, and the New York Post. But more to the point of our discussion today, he is the author of the recent book, Pagan America, The Decline of Christianity and the Dark Age to Come. Welcome, John Davidson.
Thanks for having me.
Well, we're delighted to have you. And John, before we get to the specifics of your book, concerning the Olympics, which I'm sure you're aware of, because you wrote a piece recently for the Federalist claiming that the opening ceremony heralds a rise, your words, of a neo-pagan West. Maybe we should start there. How so?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the opening of the Paris Olympics was a perfect sort of object lesson in what we're talking about when we talk about neo-paganism and the decline of Christianity. Not only was the opening, this part of the opening Olympic ceremony, which for those who hadn't seen it or hadn't heard of it, it was an obscene tableau mocking the Last Supper with transgender and drag performers in a sort of sexualized recreation of Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper. And it was infused with sort of like this pagan imagery, a blue Smurf-looking man, supposedly the Greek god Dionysus, was dropped onto the table, and it came in conjunction with a bunch of other sexualized stuff that was part of the opening ceremony. And it really was explicitly kind of on the nose neo-pagan. And the thing to understand about neo-paganism, and sort of they actually spelled it out for us, the organizers of the Paris Olympics, it's explicitly anti-Christian. It explicitly rejects and mocks and makes an ape of Christianity. It's almost the inverse of Christianity. And so you had both this sort of neo-paganism and anti-Christianism on display at the opening ceremonies. And I argue, along with many others, that this is sort of a distillation of what the post-Christian European elites kind of believe, and their vision for a post-Christian West was sort of encapsulated in this mockery of the Last Supper that we saw at the Olympic opening ceremonies.
Now, there was quite a bit of public outcry because of this, and they took down, I guess, the video footage that had been recorded on behalf of the official Olympic Committee. And then I think, John, didn't they tried to deny that it was a parody of the Last Supper, but that's not true, is it?
That's right, because some of the drag performers that were part of that had already sort of posted on their social media accounts about how it was a, drag Last Supper, or a drag Jesus. The artistic director behind it had already made statements prior to the backlash, about what this was, that this was inspired by Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. And so all this stuff was sort of already out there. In fact, the Olympics, the Paris Olympics, had advertised that part of the opening ceremony as the Last Supper on the Seine, right? Using a sort of a wordplay in French, to title that section of the opening ceremonies. And so this was already out there, and everybody screen grabbed it. It was too late to delete it. They tried very hard to sort of cover their digital tracks and issued, cease and desist orders to people who were reposting the video. But it's not that they didn't mean what they said. It's that they didn't anticipate the backlash, which was pretty, and I actually took this as an encouraging sign. It was pretty, strong across the Western world, from Christian leaders, even from political and cultural kind of leaders and influencers. The Vatican issued a statement over the weekend condemning the Olympics and demanding an apology. So that this was just them trying to sort of, they issued a non-apology, sort of like, I'm sorry if you were offended, but that's not what we meant. And then they tried to rewrite history. But we all know what they meant. And we all know that they meant to say that, what they said, on purpose, and sort of show what they showed.
Well, I don't think anybody could have predicted that this would have happened at the Olympics. I remember my wife and I talking about, boy, isn't it wonderful that every couple of years, we can sort of detune from all the terrible stuff that's happening in the world and celebrate what has traditionally been sort of a family affair, the celebration of competitive sports. And to see it ruined right from the get-go in the way it was, I think, John, is particularly timing. The timing is impressive given the publication of your book. So why don't we turn to that now?
Sure.
What led you to write a book with such a provocative, some would say hyperbolic, title? Pagan America. How do you define, what led you to write this book, and how do you define paganism?
Sure. Well, to the first question, it really was a process that kind of built over a number of years. Going back a half a dozen years now, I began to write columns occasionally about the decline of Christianity and the corruption of Western civilization and the emergence of something in its place. And it was hard at first to sort of put a finger on it, because it's, for a long time, people on the right have kind of railed against secularism, right? And sort of, atheistic secularism or woke liberalism. And it became clearer and clearer to me that what we were talking about when we talked about those things and kind of pointed them out or pointed out the insanity of this or that aspect of the culture war was not really secularism. It's not really sort of atheistic liberalism. It was a new religion. It was a new religious belief system was asserting itself in the once Christian countries of the West, namely the United States and Western Europe, right? Where the Christian population has been declining for some time, steadily. And the catalyst for it was actually a film that came out a few years ago called The Northman. I don't know if you saw this film or remembered it, but it's a Viking Age revenge epic. A good film, but not necessarily enjoyable to watch, because it depicts pre-Christian Norse pagan culture in all of its brutality, in all of its cruelty, and really almost sort of like a realistic depiction of what these pagan societies in Northern Europe were like before Christianity arrived. And I thought that the director made an unintentional case for Christian civilization by creating this film. And so I wrote a review about it. That column and a couple other columns started some conversations between me and some friends and my editor, just about, this idea that as Christianity declines in the West, the future is not this secular liberal utopia where we have a kind of live and let live libertarianism. The future is a return to the pagan past, and the rise of a neo-pagan ethos and system of belief that posits itself over and against Christianity and a Christian moral vision of the world. And that's really, once I kind of narrowed, sort of was able to sort of name what it was that I was seeing, it became clear. And part of the argument of the book, in case it isn't obvious, is that there is only one alternative to Christianity, and that is some form of paganism. And to your second question, how do I define paganism? It's hard to pin down, when we say paganism, because it has existed in all cultures throughout all of human history, across vast expanses of time and culture. But the common denominator in all pagan religions, in all pagan societies, is a rejection of transcendence, of a transcendent God, right? A rejection of objective reality and moral absolutes, and an embrace of moral relativism and subjectivity and kind of the fickleness of the divine, the divinization of the here and now, which can change and shift. And that is really the hallmarks of what we see emerging today as Christianity retreats in the West, is this assertion of this pagan worldview that embraces moral relativism and embraces subjectivity and rejects transcendent truth, and really rejects, the God of Christianity.
Most people, I think, when they think of paganism, they immediately go to, like the Marvel universe, where, right. This is the worship of maybe, ancient Greek and Roman deities. But you provide a quote in your book, I think it's from T.S. Eliot, who said paganism, and this book, as this book argues, imposed a moral relativism in which power alone determines right.
Yeah.
Yes. It's perfect definition. And the tragedy is, the founders of this country had something far different in mind, didn't they?
Yes. And part of the basis of the argument in the book is that America really was founded as a Christian nation, and it relies on Christian moral claims and Christian theological claims for its coherence, right? The proposition at the heart of the American founding, at the heart of the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, is totally Christian. It doesn't exist outside Christianity. It follows the doctrine of Imago Dei, that all men are created in the image and likeness of God, and all are equal before God. So the proposition at the heart of the American founding is Christianity and all that comes with it, right? And I don't think that we can sort of we can't really be ambiguous about that. We have to be clear about that and understand what the implications are. Because, as you say, if you reject that, then the alternative to that is not a society that's organized on the basis of human equality. It's a society that's organized on the basis of human inequality, natural inequality, which always ends up becoming a slave society in which there is a ruling caste and a slave caste. And that is the form of society that pagan cultures have always eventually taken, is slave empires. And the more advanced and powerful those civilizations are, the more thoroughly they become slave empires and impose the sort of rule by force. So force and will and coercion are the hallmarks of this worldview. That's very different and really inimically opposed to the worldview that Christianity puts forth.
Which is a frightening proposition. John Adams famously said that our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It's completely unsuitable for any other. And that's almost a quaint notion today. But you state in your book, the human race did not and could not evolve its way out of paganism. It was dragged out of it, sometimes kicking and screaming. So there was this fight in the ancient world with the law of Moses, and then finally the rise of Christianity that over the eons was able to eke out, these ancient almost animalistic appetites. But a collapse has occurred. There's no question about that. I think you also state in your book what begins with a claim that the state must be neutral toward religion ends with the imperative that the state persecute religion in the name of neutrality. John, how did this collapse occur in the United States and Western culture? I guess even further.
Yeah.
This is not just a United States phenomenon. This is happening throughout Western culture.
It is. And there's a lot of instances in the book where I talk about, I illustrate some of these points by pointing to things that are happening in Europe. A lot of times when it comes to the de-Christianization or the decline of Christianity in the West, we look to Europe. It's like kind of looking into the future a little bit for the United States. The United States has always been a little bit more religious, religiously pious, than Europe in terms of church attendance and religious devotion. But how it occurred in the United States, is something that I deal with in the book. And the problem, of course, goes back centuries, but for the purposes of discussing what happened in our country, where most of our history, we understood ourselves to be a Christian people. Our founders, as you noted, John Adams' famous quote, and there are many other quotes like that from the founders, they understood that a self-governing republic of the kind that they proposed was only going to be possible with a people that were formed and shaped and a civic culture that was formed and shaped by Christianity. And not just Christianity in theory, but the actual practice of Christianity, the Christian faith alive among the people, right? It's only, going back to all men are created equal, those, the self-evident truths, right, that are at the heart of the American founding are only self-evident to a people whose moral imaginations are formed by the Christian faith. If you don't accept the theological claims of Christianity, then none of those things are self-evident. The only thing that's self-evident is that, that the world is a violent place and the powerful are able to impose their will on the weak. And that's the basis of pagan societies. So, when we moved to get to your point about neutrality, when we moved and shifted away from having a bias in favor of Christian morality, and said instead we're going to be neutral, and this happened around the middle of the last century, right? It started before that, but there was really a really dramatic shift in the middle of the 20th century, and said we're going to impose state neutrality toward religion so that the public square and public policy can take no view of the influence of religion on public life in America. It was a radical departure from how we had thought of and even approached questions of religion and public life for our entire history. And there were some Supreme Court cases that I get into in the book that were really seminal Supreme Court cases where this shift kind of became explicit. But the idea of neutrality, I think, and I try to convey this in the book, is actually a fiction, because all societies come down with a certain perspective on major questions about the nature of man and God and how we should organize societies and what should be the basis of our public life. And so the idea that we were going to just have neutrality be the ethos around which we organize public life was never going to last. And we see that unraveling now because the state actually does take a perspective. It does have certain, metaphysical or ontological claims that it supports. And if your Christian faith contradicts that, well, then the neutrality that the state purports to have for everybody doesn't apply to you. And we see that working itself out now. Especially in California with some of the laws that are coming down from Governor Gavin Newsom and this state assembly. If you hold traditional Christian views on sex and gender and marriage and abortion, those things especially will run you afoul of the supposed state neutrality. It's not neutral at all. And I think we have to let go of this idea that neutrality was ever really the goal. The goal wasn't neutrality. The goal was a certain level of tolerance. But tolerance is a luxury that really only a predominantly Christian society can afford.
You talk in your book about what are called pejoratively, I think, the nuns. And maybe you can expound on this a little bit, but I take it that these are people that claim not to have really any specific worldview. They don't ascribe to any particular belief, and that makes them somehow more open-minded. And but I'm reminded by G.K. Chesterson's quote, who said, when people stop believing in God, they don't believe in nothing. They believe in anything.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And Chesterton is a great wealth of knowledge on all of the subjects. I quote him heavily and rely on his work in the book. He's absolutely right. The nuns are sort of the avatar for this misguided notion about neutrality. And, you know, one of the things that, in writing and studying this, that is a really helpful resource is that we've been surveying people about their religious views in this country for decades. So there's a lot of data on how people self-identify. And the nuns are those people, and this arose, you know, decades ago. Demographically, this group started showing up in surveys of religious life in America. The nuns, the people who say that they have their religious identification is none. They have no religious identification. And they don't say they're Christian or Muslim or Jewish or Buddhist or even atheist. They just say religious affiliation, none. And these are the group of people that are most likely to call themselves spiritual but not religious. And so this is an important point that I try to tease out in the book. These aren't necessarily atheists. These are people who are open to spiritual ideas. They're open to the metaphysical and the supernatural, which makes them perfect neo-pagans, right? And to Chesterton's famous quote, they're open to really anything. And a person who's open to anything is going to find something to worship. And they may not, these neo-pagans may not call what they're doing paganism. They may not even call the things they worship gods. But they will nevertheless adopt that same pagan attitude, and the same really pagan worldview and moral code, which again comes back to will and eventually coercion and force. And the rise of the nuns, I think, is an underappreciated demographic development. If we continue on our current trajectory, sometime, you know, in the next 40 years, the nuns will be a majority in the United States. And at that point, I don't think that there's going to be any basis for us to expect that we retain things like freedom of religion or freedom of speech, right? These aren't things that people who are willing to believe in anything are going to defend, because there's no basis for it. If you reject Christianity, then you're going to reject the basis for that kind of tolerance of freedom of speech and freedom of religion. And I think we're starting to see that now.
And what's so ironic, I think, John, in my own mind, is that much of the 20th century, certainly with the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species in 1859, late 19th century, and then going into the 20th century, much of Western culture has prided itself on materialism, you know, the total rejection of any belief in God whatsoever, that everything that exists is a function of matter, principally, even human consciousness. And at the same time, we are seeing this rise of beliefs in these ancient animistic pagan beliefs,
right.
You know, and they admit it. And you quote people who admit to these things. They want to have a spiritual life, but also ascribe to the materialist worldview. But
yes,
as you point out, there is very much a spiritual manifestation behind paganism. And I think you have a chapter in your book that leans a little bit on C.S. Lewis and talks about the materialist magician. Maybe you can remind our audience, for those who are not familiar with Lewis's work in the Screwtape Letters, what that refers to.
Yeah, it's a great passage in the Screwtape Letters. The Screwtape Letters, of course, is an epistolatory novel. It's a series of letters from a senior demon, Screwtape, to his nephew, a lower demon, Wormwood, about Wormwood's human subject, who he's trying to sort of, damn to hell and ensnare him into sin. And Wormwood asks Screwtape whether or not it's their policy, the policy of hell and Satan and the demons, to remain concealed from humanity. And Screwtape gives a very interesting answer where he says that for now the policy is to remain concealed and to hide their presence and their activity from mankind. And he says the reason we remain concealed is because if we reveal ourselves, then we can we destroy the secular materialist worldview that we've worked so hard to inject into mankind. But he said the problem with this is that if we don't reveal ourselves, then we can make no magicians. In other words, they can't have sort of witches and wizards and open, paganistic occult worshipers if they don't reveal themselves. He said, so for now, our policy is to remain hidden, but we look forward to a time when a new sort of man can be created. And he calls this the materialist magician. While retaining the materialism, the point of retaining the materialist worldview is to keep people's minds closed to the belief in God, but open them to the notion of spiritual forces, or spiritual powers that they will become enthralled to. And they won't say that they're worshiping. They won't say that they're serving these forces. They will be impersonal forces. And he posits it's very prescient. And he wrote this, in the middle of the last century. So he was very, very forward looking, very prescient in understanding what's happening. Because we see this happening now. People who, on the one hand, claim a materialist worldview, deny any religion, deny even belief in God, but are open to spiritual and supernatural forces that they seek out and that influence them and that they all but serve without saying that they serve. And this is a very dangerous situation, right? Because this is how people get ensnared into what amounts to a paganistic and occultic world.
In fact, you even make mention
and that's happening now. We see that happening.
You even make mention in your book of people that claim to be Satanists who sort of subscribe themselves to the materialist magician belief or mindset. In fact, you quote Mary Harrington, who wrote a book called How Satanism Conquered America. And this is what she writes. At its core, Satanism is simply the doctrine of untrammeled individualism, shorn of any link to the divine. To put it another way, Satanists are just very, very liberal. It's quite a statement.
That's right. And, in that passage, I also talk about Paradise Lost, John Milton's depiction of Satan as just a being of pure will, unable to submit to the authority of God, unwilling to do so, even at the pains of being trapped in hell, would rather rule hell than serve God in heaven. And that's a lot of what liberalism comes down to, is that the elevation of one's own, not just one's own will, but one's own judgment about what is right and wrong, about one's own nature, about reality itself. Not just rejecting God, but really rejecting the givenness of nature and the givenness of reality. And we see this, for example, in the transgender movement, the rejection of the givenness and the objective reality of biology, for example. And we see this in the abortion debate too. The obvious truth that an unborn human being is a human being. Having to disfigure our own reason in order to justify the legality of killing unborn children, is a rejection of reality itself and a supplanting of reality with one's own will, coercion, force. These are the hallmarks of the pagan worldview, and we see them working themselves out in sort of the modern world today.
And of course, part of paganism, and again, going back to the Marvel universe, you see this in their movies and in their writings. There's this sort of effort to transcend what it means to be human, right? It's called transhumanism. And I think you make the point in your book that transgenderism is sort of a entryway into that mindset, and it's frightening to see where this is going to take us. In fact, I guess transreligion in some circles is called terrorism. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was the name that one sort of transhumanist, transgender writer gave it. But it's, transgenderism, which we talk about all the time, sort of in the context of our cultural and political debates, is really the tip of the iceberg. It's the most outwardly obvious and politically volatile manifestation of a whole worldview that rejects biological reality and posits instead a technological reality in which we, using our technology and using our own, channeling our will and our desires through powerful technology, can create our own realities, can create our own biological realities, can create our own psychological or cognitive realities through virtual, a kind of virtual reality or digital consciousness. These are people who not only posit that a man can become a woman and vice versa, but that we can become disembodied and retain our consciousness, that we can upload our consciousness to a digital cloud and live forever. And this really, the further you drill down on this, the more obvious it becomes that these are all species of the original lie in the garden from the serpent. You shall not surely die. You will be as gods. That's the lie at the heart of the pagan worldview. And that's the lie at the heart of transhumanism, which is a kind of new, post-Christian religion that, of which transgenderism is only one manifestation. But we're going to see a lot more talk about this, especially as AI gets more powerful and prevalent and as technology advances. The specifics and the broad contours of this worldview are going to come clearly into focus.
You mentioned abortion earlier, and there seems to be a movement in America and Western culture where abortion almost becomes thought of as a spiritual exercise. And you give some instances of this in your book. There was one person, I can't remember what her name was. She put out a video called Shout Your Abortion. And she says, having an abortion made me happy in a totally unqualified way. Why wouldn't I be happy that I was not forced to become a mother? And then later on, you state the destruction of another human life is an act of self-love. A video posted in 2022 shows a young woman walking viewers through a step-by-step procedure of how to build an altar of mifepristone with misoprostol abortion. I had never heard this before, but I looked into a little bit, and indeed, you're correct. This is happening across the country.
Yes, and it goes hand in hand with a rise in interest, especially among young people, an interest in pagan practices, in witchcraft, in spells, in building altars. And I was very disturbed to discover that this too is a trend of mythologizing or paganizing abortion. And this instance of, a step by step about how to build an altar to your abortion is one instance of this. It's a perfect object lesson in this notion of the materialist magician, right? Because these women are instructing others on how to, sacramentalize really, the taking of another human life. Which of course has been a hallmark of paganism since the very beginning. Human sacrifice and child sacrifice are features of every pagan society in every part of the world throughout all of human history. And in our time, just because they don't call it pagan human sacrifice doesn't mean that isn't what it is. They are sacrificing their children, in exchange for some concrete good. In this case, their freedom to go earn money or to be, sexually, unbound, or to realize their own dreams, whatever, however they, a person might put it. That's what they're receiving. And what they have to do in exchange for that is to sacrifice this child. And so you're starting to see almost like this, like this grudging, like half-spoken awareness of it among these so-called nuns, to go back to the nuns, right? Who realize that what they've done and how they've done it and their whole mindset about it isn't necessarily secular materialist, like atheistic. They recognize that a life has been taken. And so they are making altars to it. They are engaging in witchcraft and other pagan practices, in response to what really is a pagan sacrament. And we see this, this is happening online and has been increasing since COVID. But really the shift in abortion rhetoric has been going on for years. And this is one of the ways I talk about how the kind of the materialist secular worldview collapses eventually. Like it's not durable in the face of reality. And with abortion, we saw when abortion was first legalized in Roe v. Wade, it was the justification was that this is just a clump of cells. It's not a human being. You're not taking a life. It's no different than getting an appendectomy. And so let's not make this about whether or not the unborn children are children. They're not. Quickly, advances in medical technology made that position untenable. Totally nonsense. We all knew that, if we didn't know before, certainly technology made it undeniable, just even in the years after Roe v. Wade, that this was a unique human life that, from the very beginning. And so the rhetoric around abortion shifted. In the 90s, with the Clinton administration, you had this rhetoric of safe, legal, and rare. We admit that abortion is unfortunate. It's a sad thing, but it should be a rare thing. And then eventually around 2015, this movement, the Shout Your Abortion movement started, and it was a positive defense of abortion, saying abortion, it's not that it's sad or unfortunate or that it should be safe, legal, and rare. It's a positive good. And it's a positive assertion of the will of the mother over the life of her child. And in that, again, it bears all the hallmarks of a pagan worldview.
And it's one thing for individuals to believe this. It's another thing when an entire society, including commerce and industry, buys into it and becomes part of it as well. We've seen that with the abortion industry, and now we're seeing it with sex and gender theory. Obviously, it's being taught in our nation's classrooms around the country. Our own ministry, Protect Our Kids, has definitive proof of curriculums based around telling children, beginning in even pre-K and kindergarten, that their sexual identities are completely subjective. They can decide for themselves whatever they want to be. As they progress into older ages, the materials become more and more sophisticated, which finally leads to people declaring themselves to be not just an opposite gender, but something completely in between or no gender at all. You make a statement in your book, and we've talked about this on the program many times. 10 years ago, there wasn't one gender-affirming clinic in the entire country. Now there are hundreds scattered across the country. And major medical associations, psychological associations have bought completely into this. They completely subscribe to this worldview where you can self-identify with whatever gender you want to be.
Yeah, it's remarkable the more you dig into this, how prevalent and how quickly, as you say, this spread. Not just the gender clinics themselves, which are totally scandalous and really a lot of people should be in prison for what they've done, completely ignoring medical practice, medical ethics, and ruining the lives of thousands of young people, in the name of an ideology and really a religious fervor that has no basis in medical science. These gender clinics that provide so-called gender affirming care are prescribing treatments and therapies of drugs and surgeries that are not treating a disease or an ailment. They're advancing an ideology and really a religious worldview. And it's absolutely a contagion. Abigail Shrier, in her famous book, Irreversible Damage, she talks about the sudden social contagion of transgender or non-binary self-identification among teenage girls, almost like in clusters, from the same schools or the same school districts. All of a sudden, teenage girls who had no history of any kind of gender or sexual orientation questioning would all of a sudden, all as one, identify as non-binary or transgender. And a lot of it, as you say, is coming from the schools. Now, I'm not an expert in public education, but you don't have to be an expert to know what the public schools are pushing, because parents, when they find out about this stuff, are outraged. And, one of the unintended consequences of school lockdowns and remote schooling during COVID is that a lot of parents found out exactly what was being taught in some of these schools and what wasn't being taught as well. And we're horrified by it. And we're starting to see some pushback. I don't think that will change the system. Just the pushback alone from parents, we need the force of law to change the system as well. But it's a huge problem, and it's people think it maybe is only in just large cities or something. It's not. It's in every public school district in the country is dealing with this. You can't hide from it. You can't run from it. Doesn't matter if you live in a red state or a conservative area. Your public school is infiltrated, and this stuff is being pushed on kids. Yeah,
John. There are some celebrated cases. In fact, the Olympics is highlighting one right now about people who are legitimately born with ambiguous, maybe sexual organs. They used to be called intersex. Now they're called sexual development disorder, I think is the current sort of the term of art that's being used. But by far and away, most of the people that are engaging in gender affirming care, there is no ambiguity on their right. Sexual development. And it seems to be, and I think you make this point in your book, that what underlies this demand to be identified subjectively with whatever you determine, there's a metaphysical claim behind that, isn't there? What is that claim?
Oh, yeah. That we are gods and that we can create our own reality. Again, going back to the garden, you shall be as God. The idea that reality itself isn't fixed, and it is subject to our will. The transgender movement and transgender activists talk about one of their buzzwords is people being their authentic selves, like wanting to live their authentic selves. What that really is an assertion of one's own will over and against reality. That's what that is. And it follows that it produces a kind of disfigurement of reason, right? It's a common misnomer to think that there's some sort of disconnect between faith and reason, right? But as Christians know, faith and reason go hand in hand. They're complementary. There is no contradiction between faith and reason. The scientific method in Western science itself was a product of Christian civilization. And so what we see with the rise of transgender ideology and this transgender movement is a disfigurement of reason and the abuse of science, the abuse of objective data and knowledge, which is why there's no studies, right, that back up any of the claims of the transgender movement. There can't be any studies that back up the claims because the claims aren't based on reality. They're based on the assertion of the will over and against biological reality. And I think that's something people need to understand, that like there is no way to argue against this movement with, by citing studies or data or science, because they don't really care about those things. That they may pay lip service to them, but that's not what's important to them, and that's not what's going to determine what they do.
And it leads to increasingly bizarre and frighteningly outcomes. A lot of this comes down to lowering the age of child consent about what they can decide and what they can't decide. In fact, I guess there's a phenomenon, this is the first time I heard about it when I read it in your book, is people claiming that some of their limbs are not part of their identity and therefore they should be removed. And if they have the power to change their sexual identity, why shouldn't they have the power and be able to consent to having bodily limbs removed as well? And of course, this also bleeds into the topic of sexual relations between children and adults, something that has been taboo for centuries in Western culture, again, based on the Judeo-Christian worldview. But that is changing now, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's a logical consequence of this worldview, right? If a 13 or a 14-year-old can consent to an irreversible medical procedure where their breasts or their genitals are removed, then why can't they consent to sexual relations with anyone, including an adult? It doesn't make any sense that you would restrict their consent in that instance, but allow it in this other instance. And consent as being the thread on which they're going to hang any kind of like restrictions, or that they're going to base the law on, is a very thin thread indeed, because consent can be manufactured. You don't hinge these things on consent. You hinge them on reality. And the reality is minors, children, young people are not capable of giving their consent to these things. We have understood this in the United States and in Western civilization for a long time, which is why parents are empowered to make decisions on behalf of their children, because children cannot make these decisions themselves. And so when you argue against that and you say, no, children can make these decisions themselves, well, then you're opening up Pandora's box and saying that the children can make all kinds of decisions on their own. They can give their consent to things previously we thought they couldn't. And the logic of it is inexorable, and you can tell where it's going. And in the book, I walk through how it's evidence of how it's already heading in this direction, with the breakdown of the family, and the destruction of family relationships in law. And we're looking at a future in which legally, like, polyamorous couples involving more than two adults, not couples, but groups of people, are going to be recognized as families with children involved in that are unrelated to the adults, putting them in grave danger. And we're to accept this based on the consent, that whatever adults consent to must be legal. Well, that's insane. And that's a recipe, not only for the victimization of children on a large scale, but for the collapse of society itself.
In fact, much of this was predicted early on. I remember in California there was a amendment to the Constitution, the state constitution, proclaiming that marriage was between one man and one woman, and that passed by a 52 to 48%. I mean, a clear majority. And then, of course, it was challenged in court and overruled by the Ninth Circuit. And one of the dissenting judges in that case, I can't remember his name, predicted that as a result of this, allowing same-sex marriage would open the door to polyamorous marriage and polygamous marriage. And we're seeing that seeing that happen now. So this is all very frightening. It seems like the pagan state is already here in America, and there are lots of evidences for this, and you cite some of them in your book. Public funds to pay for gender-affirming care in our state and federal prisons today. Military personnel forced to shower with those who identify with the opposite sex. The promotion of transgender policy in public education. Laws that strip parents of their rights to control the upbringing of their children. I'm here in California, and Assembly Bill 1955 was just passed. I don't know if you're aware of it. that basically makes it illegal for a teacher to notify a parent of a 5-year-old or a 10-year-old that child now is identifying with a non-biological sex. Christian beliefs disqualify, in many cases, one from public service. Corporations, where major media outlets and elite institutions are all in lockstep with this radical individualism. And I can go on and on. Of course, there's the cases against the florists and the bakers that continue to go on in the court system. It paints a very distressing picture, John. And you don't pull any punches in your book. You seem to imply that we're headed for something that is very ominous in nature, unless something happens to turn the ship around.
Yeah, and this is not meant to be a counsel of despair, and I say so in the book. On the contrary, I think that there's a kind of relief to be able to just kind of recognize what is happening, what has happened, and accept the reality of it, and to be clear-eyed about the present and about the future. That I find anyway that there's a relief in that, because then you don't have to have false hope. You don't have to have optimism. You can have real hope, and you can rely on the sources of real hope, which is, as Christians, is our Lord and His church. But I think we do have to be honest. And part of my motivation for writing the book was to help people wake up and wrap their heads around what's happening. Because I think kind of in the scrum of our political debates and our culture wars, and we get into this kind of cyclical mindset that we think like, oh, if we can just win the White House back, or if we can just get, a majority on the Supreme Court, or we can just retake the House, then our policies will go into place, and then we can turn the ship around. And I think that's wrong. The reality is we were, all of us, born into a world in which Christianity was in a state of precipitous decline in the West. And the roots of this go back, very, very far indeed. They certainly predate the lives of anyone who's alive today. And so this is kind of a situation that we inherited. And we have to recognize it for what it is, so that we can know how to fight back against it, so we can know how to prepare our children and our grandchildren for really a Western world in which Christianity is not the dominant force in public life and is not the dominant force in our civilization. But the hope that we have is not just the hope that we have as Christians, that the final victory is in Jesus Christ, and that He's promised us His church would never perish from the earth, but that the only thing that has ever shattered the hold of paganism over societies was its encounter with Christianity. Because Christianity posits something over and against paganism that is irresistible, and that is reality and the truth. And that is why, across vast expanses of time and geography and cultures, any pagan society that was broken from that stranglehold, it was broken by Christianity. And it will be, as the Christian world in the West shrinks, it will become more potent and more powerful, because instead of having nominal Christians in our churches, we will have faithful Christians who understands the reality of our faith, and who take it seriously, and who are warriors for Christ. And that more potent, faithful Christian church will be the spearhead that shatters the pagan hold on the post-Christian West. And that's my hope. And so, at the end of the book, I talk about, what some of the ways that we can shift our thinking, right now, to reflect that ultimate reality and that fight to come.
Yeah, in our closing minutes, I wanted to ask you about that. I know you're a fan of Ron Dreher, who wrote the book Live Not by Lies. And he's quite famous for putting forth his option called the Benedict option, which, and I don't want to malign what is actually meant by that, so correct me if I'm wrong, but basically it stood for the proposition that people of faith, society may come to the point where people of faith have to sort of close in on themselves to protect the culture of faith against the world at large. And I know you're a fan of his as well, but you conclude a little bit different option. Again, named after a famous saint, Saint Boniface, and it's a subtle but different choice of future that you're recommending. Maybe we can conclude with you talking a little bit about what the Boniface option is.
Yeah, and I want to be fair to Rod. The Benedict option was a great book, and it was very prescient, as most of his work is. It came out in 2017, though, and I think things have moved faster since 2017 than even Rod envisioned, and have gotten much worse, much more quickly than any of us expected. And I think that while the Benedict option is necessary, it's not sufficient. It's not enough to sort of preserve the flame in our own private schools and church communities and faith communities, and sort of ride out the storm. We do have to preserve the flame, and we do have to ride out the storm and pass the faith on to our children. Rod Dreher is absolutely right that if you're not a monk or a nun, you should run your house like a monastery. That's how you pass the faith on to your children. That's how Christian civilization survives. It starts in the home. But where I gently take issue with him is just really in a matter of emphasis. And I titled the last chapter, The Boniface Option, after St. Boniface, who was known as the apostle to the Germans. It was his burning desire to proselytize and convert the pagans of Germany and Northern Europe, which he asked for permission to do and spent his life in the pursuit of. He was martyred, actually, by a pagan raiding party when he was an old man after spending a lifetime proselytizing and converting pagan Saxons. This was in the 10th century, right? And the lesson from Boniface, he famously cut down a sacred oak tree, the Donner oak or Thor's oak tree, in front of a big crowd of pagans that was outraged that he was doing this. But he took bold action to strike down these pagan idols, to send a message to them that the Christian God was the true God over and against these pagan gods. This is almost kind of an Old Testament approach. We see the Old Testament prophets doing the same thing, famously. But the point for us and the lesson for our time is that it's not enough to just practice your faith in private. We can't buy into the lie anymore that religion and faith are a private matter, and you have to sort of check them at the door of the public square when you go out into the world. We have to bring our faith that we are preserving and that we are cultivating in our churches and in our schools and in our private homes. We have to bring it out into the public square. We have to find and fight on ground that we can win in the public square, and that means taking over the city council, the school board, the libraries, bringing back public displays of religious devotion, and insisting that they be part of public life in America, as they were for most of our history. We have to argue on that basis and act on that basis, and view our country as and ourselves as Christians in a post-Christian America as soldiers on a beachhead, right? And you don't live on the beachhead. You're there as a starting off point to push further in, to push forward. And that's the attitude we have to take. And it may mean it'll mean different things for different people, but it may mean making major changes to your life, to where you live and how you live. But those are the things we have to start thinking about seriously, because this isn't a fight that's going to be won, I don't think, in our lifetimes. We're fighting now for our children and our grandchildren, that maybe by God's grace, the pagan hold over our country will be broken by future generations, and they will be able to refound the Christian Republic that we once had.
The hour is very late, and I couldn't agree more with your comments that people, the conservative citizens, people of faith, need to get involved in asserting what their faith really, really means. I'm reminded of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the famous Soviet immigrant who escaped from Russian gulags that came to America. And I think it was in 1971 that he gave a famous address at Harvard called A World Split Apart, where even back in the early 70s, he saw the threat to Western civilization. He saw the rise of paganism even back then. And he stated that the virtue that is most in need for Western civilization, and particularly in America, is courage. And I think what you're talking about, John, is going to require the individual and corporate courage on the part of Americans if hope is going to become a reality.
Absolutely. Yeah. We have to embrace our situation, and the only way you're going to embrace our situation as it really is with courage, and courage, understood in its classical and Christian sense, the dogged pursuit of good, no matter the consequences and against all odds. And that's what's required now. Luckily we have reason to hope, and we have reason to be of good courage. Well,
John Daniel Davidson, I want to thank you again for taking the time to be on our program. It's been highly enlightening, and I want to encourage our listening audience, please go out and get yourself a copy of Pagan America, The Decline of Christianity and the Dark Age to Come. John, where can people find you? I know you write for the Federalist. Are there other ways that people can find you and follow you?
Yeah, thefederalist.com is where most of my work appears, sort of on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis. I'm on Twitter at John D. Davidson. And of course, you can get the book wherever you get books.
Well, that's all the time that we have for today, but I hope this has been enlightening for you, and we look forward to speaking with you again on our next episode. Protect Our Kids is having a gala in Southern California on October the 5th, and if you're in town, you're certainly invited to that, and I want to encourage you to be there because John is going to be our keynote speaker, so you are very welcome to meet him in person and get a signed copy of his book. So thank you again, and we'll see you here soon.